All right, Eric, you're good to go.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome. I'm very, very happy to present to you today with the support of the Sigur Center, Professor Guangtian Ha of Haverford College, our near neighbor up in Pennsylvania. Professor Ha, I think, is one of the most innovative, interesting, and engaged scholars of Islam in China of the 21st century. Today, we are here to discuss his amazing new book. Let me make sure I get the title correct: "The Sound of Salvation," which was meant to be published already. So there's going to be a link in the chat to it because supply chain issues have delayed publication, but you'll be able to look it up soon. And to me, I think it is a field-changing book, potentially. It is an incredibly rich ethnography, unprecedented, really, of a Chinese-speaking Muslim community in northwestern China. But Professor Ha has previously been many things. He has completed his PhD in anthropology at Columbia University, after which he went off to be a research fellow and associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he was part of the Soundscapes of Islam in China project. And partly as a product of that, he's been a co-editor of a couple of important books, one being, here's one, Ethnographies of Islam in China, and another, which I might call one of the strangest, most stimulating projects ever undertaken on this topic, The Contest of the Fruits, which he co-edited with the art collective Slavs and Tatars. So my understanding is today, Professor Ha will introduce his new book for about 15 minutes. We'll have a little discussion, then we'll open up the floor to audience Q&A. And so without further ado, my dear colleague, Professor Guangtian Ha, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Schluessel. And so I will take probably about 15 to 20 minutes to introduce the book. And then I suppose Professor Schluessel will kick off with a few questions before we start the conversation. And there might be slight technical glitches here and there because there will be audios in the presentation. And in one case, I will try to, recite over the audio file to show you how the recitation works in real time. So there might be slight glitches, so please bear with me. Now let me share my screen. Right, so I hope you can see the slides now. Right? Oops, my apologies. Right, so the title of the book is The Sound of Salvation, Voice, Gender, and the Sufi Mediascape in China. So in short, it's an ethnography of the Islamic recitation practiced among the Jahriyya Sufis in China. The word Jahriyya is derived from the Arabic word jahr, which means to be loud or to be public. So literally the Jahriyya simply means the loud ones. We know that nearly all Sufis and all Muslims recite the Quran. And Sufis also recite their own liturgical texts. Some are poetry, others are prose. And the Jahriyya belong to this tradition, but at the same time, they also define themselves by this recitation. As you can see from the name, it's called Jahriyya, literally the loud ones. So recitation is not simply a medium for establishing connections with the divine. Recitation is central, is at the heart of a Jahriyya identity. And the Jahriyya Sufis in China claim descent from the Naqshbandiyya. And we know that by the 18th century, at least, Naqshbandiyya had become a global Sufi order with Sufi lodges and foundations around the world. The Jahriyya in China trace their descent from the Naqshbandiyya, specifically in southern Arabia, in particular in Yemen. Although if we look at their Arabic and Persian texts, we can also detect traces of connections linking the Jahriyya to South Asia and Central Asia. For instance, there's one text used by the Jahriyya that actually linked them to 20th century Sufism in India. Now we know that all Sufis visit tombs. Tomb visitation was a core feature of Sufism. So this is basically a map of the major Jahriyya tombs scattered across China. My own work focused on the Sufi shrines, the Jahriyya Sufi shrines, largely in northwestern China, here in Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region, in Gansu Province, in the Uyghur homeland, and also in southwestern China. When I say northwestern China, that's clearly inaccurate when you look at the map, because when you look at Ningxia and Gansu, they are literally at the geometrical center, at the heart of China, and they are considered northwestern because Beijing, which is in eastern China, was thought to be, is still considered to be the heart of China, the center of China. So anything to the northwest of Beijing is considered northwestern China. That's a massive northwest. So this is the cover of the book, and you can also see the table of content. And following the really venerable tradition of anthropology, all the titles provide you with little useful information. And if you want to know more, maybe, right. So this is basically a chart that shows the content of each chapter. The book starts with an examination of the nitty-gritty of Arabic and Persian pedagogy among the Jahriyya Sufis. For instance, this is how the Arabic alphabet is pronounced in the Jahriyya way and in a presumably standard way.
Alif, Bie, Tie, Xie, Zhimu, Har, He, Dalin, Zalin, Re, Ze, Shini, Shini, Swazi, Zwazi, To, Zo, Ayin, Ghain, Bei, Kaf, Kaf, Liamu, Mimu, Nuni, Wawu, He, Ya. Elfun, Bavun, Tavun, Thavun, Jimun, Harvun, Khavun, Dalun, Valun, Ravun, Zayun, Sinun, Shinun, Swadun, Tadun, Tavun, Twavun, Ainun, Ghainun, Fav, Qafun, Kafun, Liamun, Mimun, Nunun, Wawun, Havun, Yavun.
So earlier works on Islam in China normally claim that this kind of pronunciation, if it's examined at all, to be a result of assimilation into the Chinese linguistic and cultural sphere, which is not incorrect. But there's also a multilingual history behind the production of this kind of pronunciation. We know from day one, Arabic as a language is not one. Even in recitation, Arabic as a language has different variations. When Islam expanded at first beyond Arabia into Iraq and Iran and Syria, there had been debates among Arabic scholars especially about how to pronounce Arabic properly in order to recite Sufi poetry and to recite the Quran. So this whole controversy, this whole debate over how to pronounce Arabic from the very beginning is central to the expansion of Islam, especially when Islam expanded into other linguistic areas. In this case, in China, where actually in this area you combine Chinese, Arabic, and Persian. So the first chapter really tries to examine how this pronunciation is produced in a multilingual process involving the learning of Chinese, Arabic, and Persian at the same time normally. And chapter 2 builds on this examination of linguistic phonemes and sounds to see how these sounds fit together to form organized musical recitations of Islam. And I examined this organized recitation through an investigation of the text called Muhammas, which is derived from the word tahmiz, which in poetic terms means making something fivefold. For instance, to take 2 lines of a poetry and add 3 lines, and make 5-line stanzas. And this particular recording I'm going to show you is not really a recitation of Muhammad. It's a recitation of Surah Al-Mulk from the Quran. But I want to really give you a sense of the kind of group dynamic in the recitation I examined in the book. And in this particular recitation of the Quran, you can see different reciters passing around different sections of the chapter, different verses, and there are different ways of breaking down the verses in a recitation. So this exemplar represents only one way of doing it.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور الذي خلق 7 سماوات طباقا في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فرد البصر هل ترى من فوق ثم رد البصر ترى يضيق إليك البصر خاشعا وهو حشير ولغزانا سمان دنيا بمصابيح النار من شاد وتزن عصبا سيري وللذين كفروا بربهم عذاب جهنم وبئس المصير.
So I find this kind of continuous flow really interesting. At a certain point, the coalescence of these recitations transcend each one reciter. And at that point, you have a very clear feeling as a reciter in the group that you are together building something that transcends all of your recitations. And I find the same kind of dynamic across different recitations. And I think that's really interesting as a way of building and sustaining community. So in chapter 3, I examine how this kind of musical dynamic in a recitation articulate with larger, broader societal changes. And then in the chapter after this one, I examine the mediatization of the recitation, how the subtle changes in pronunciation gets amplified in the recitation, and how this recitation, in being circulated, generate larger debates pertaining to the position of Sinophone Islam in relation to transnational Islam. Because if your pronunciation and recitation does not sound so-called standard, then where are you in this larger community? I think those of us who work on Islam in China, especially Sinophone Muslims in China, this is a very common question we'll have to grapple with. And then in the closing chapter, I look at gender not simply as one of the questions to be addressed in the ethnography, but rather as a central prism, an essential lens through which to rewrite the entire ethnography. So if you think about the entire book as a kebab, the last chapter is more like the skewer that goes through all of the meat. And maybe I can show you, in relation in particular to the kind of musical vocal dynamic I mentioned in the previous slide, I can demonstrate how this dynamic works using this one example. It's one page, one stanza from Muhammad, the 5-fold poem. And so we have a recording here, and I will try to recite and read as well along with the recording, so you can hear from me this voice in real time, how a reciter actually joins this flow. So I don't know if you, sorry for the glitch, and I don't know if you hear the end of, suppose you know Arabic, the end of line 2, because if I read the line, it's فَاللَّهَ أَحْمَدُ رَبَّ الْعَالَمِينَ عَلَى تَخْمِيسِ بُرْدَتِي إِذْ بِالْمَوْلَوِي عَلَى. So this last word, ala, at the end of both lines, they make the two lines rhyme. And the same can be said of all subsequent lines except the last line. But in the Arabic, in the Jahriyya recitation, it's precisely at these 2 points, the ala and the ila are dropped. They are not recited by the whole group, but only done individually. So it's exactly at those points where in the recitation you can produce the poetic rhythm. It's precisely at those points that the rhythm was cut short by the recitation itself. So in other words, the Arabic rhythm is entirely reorganized by the recitation, and there is a specific Jahriyya rhythm and rhyme to it, and Jahriyya tune to it, not to mention. So the entire structure of the Arabic poetry is changed in the course of the recitation, which again can be said about many other Islamic recitation as well, not specific to the Jahriyya. Now, so these are probably some of the small contributions the book tries to make to the study of Islam in China. First, history. The book tries to use more Arabic and Persian texts in addition to the Chinese texts to situate China's Jahriyya Sufism and Naqshbandiyya in particular, in general, in the trans-regional Sufi world. And secondly, in terms of languages and politics, it tries to, by using these Arabic and Persian texts and sources, to return the whole question of Sinophone Islam and Sinophone Sufism to classical Islamic studies, to the studies of sound and music and Islamic recitation, and contemporary politics concerning standard recitation. We have works of this kind addressing Islam in Indonesia, for instance, or Islam in Iran, but we haven't had work that bring the study of Islam in China into this larger conversation. And in terms of ethnography, I tried to provide a detailed description of a range of likely endangered ritual practices centered on sound. So one of the purposes of writing this book is also to really leave a record, create a kind of ethnographic archive for future generations of Jahriyya followers. Many of the practices described in this book have already disappeared in the past 3 or 4 years, given the political situation. And many of the people who recited for me in the same space are now scattered all over China. So in many ways, the ethnography was also an effort at preservation, in addition to making some kind of larger argument. So what is the argument that the book tries to make? In our academic works, we're supposed to make some kind of argument at the end. If it's entirely for preservation, it doesn't work. So the concept I try to develop in the book is fragile transcendence. We can probably discuss this concept more in the Q&A session. In short, the concept fragile transcendence really tries to capture the kind of wide variations of sound and liturgical practices among the Jahriyya. We normally have this understanding or this notion that for a society or for a community to sustain its own integrity, sustain its own social glue, all of the rituals need to be performed in a more or less uniform way. And same set of rituals and same ways or same set of manners for performing these rituals, and same set of explanations given of these ritual practices. But what is interesting about the Jahriyya is that you actually find wide variations, diversities, heterogeneities in the practice of the recitation. Instead of homogeneity, you find heterogeneity, and it's precisely this kind of diversity that sustains the social glue that binds the Jahriyya followers together. Now, to show one example of this kind of musical diversity among the Jahriyya, I can play you 2 pieces of recitation from the same, well, it's, reciting the same text. The text is called orad. In this case, orad refers to a collection of short Quranic verses and formulaic incantations. So it's the same text, but two different versions of the recitation. And even in one version of the recitation, the first version I'm going to play for you, there's also variations in the, in the pitch. So when I play this recording, please take care to listen for the harmony, which is actually not supposed to be there. I hope you spotted those places where you heard where there is a harmony. In other words, where the pitches vary across different reciters. And that's not supposed to happen because everyone is, at least according to the Jahriyya leader, to follow exactly the same pitch, the same tune without any variation whatsoever. And that's supposed to be uniform. But then you have this kind of natural organic harmony, which actually results from learning from different saints and learning from different masters, and each master follows his own tradition. So you have this coalescence, this convergence of divergent, slightly divergent sounds in the same space, even in the same recording. And that basically encodes the entire complex history of migrations, of the segmentation of Jahriyya lineages. So it's in a way quite amazing to hear that history in the sound in one recording, in these subtle variations in the pitch, in the recitation. And then here is a second piece, which is collected from southern Ningxia. The first piece was recorded in northern Ningxia. And let's see if you can really hear the difference in rhythm, even in the tune itself. I hope you heard the difference. And just imagine these two recitations taking place in exactly the same space at the same time and trying to sync with each other. And that's how, in a way, negotiations of sound take place among the Jahriyya, not by talking, but by reciting in the same space. And that's also a negotiation between different histories. So in a way, history is really embodied by these sounds, and people are negotiating histories, negotiating divisions without talking, but through recitation. And this kind of variations in sound is at least derived from the variations in murshidin, which means murshid here means the guide or the Sufi master. Murshidin is the plural form in this case. So historically speaking, because of the histories of the clashes with the imperial state and because of the histories of migrations of Sufis, Sufi never stayed put in one place. The murshid, the saints, always travel to different places. So naturally you have divisions among the Jahriyya based on geographical locations, based upon the specific saint or subsidiary saint, or even the descendants of a saint that you follow. So naturally in history you have a large number of divisions among the Jahriyya in terms of all these different factors. And as a result of these divisions, you have variations of sound, variations of liturgical practices derived from equally valid teachings of different saints. To the point, you hear this statement from many Jahriyya: I do not know where or from whom they learned that practice, but I suppose they learned it from some saint. So as the speaker, I don't know who that saint is, but by observing those practices, which are both similar and different from mine, I can presume that behind those practices, there was, or there is, some saint behind it. And I don't know the identity or even the history of that saint, but I can't deny that saint's existence. So it's this sense of uncertainty, suspicion, which I think underpins this notion of fragile transcendence. It's fragile because it's not based upon any firm knowledge that there is this saint who is behind these practices. It's based upon this uncertain assumption, but it's transcendence because I'm presuming the existence of some saint I don't know. So this abstract saint transcends all of the currently existing or historically existent saints. So I think this is a very, to me, very interesting and enlightening way of seeing difference. Those who are different from us, I don't know why they are different, but I presume there is a reason behind it. So in the book, I really try to examine this, how this way of looking at difference emerges in the thick liturgical practices of the Jahriyya. So that's the argument. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. And this is the discount code for the book.
All right, Professor Ha. So wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for being here. By the way, I was somehow caught off guard by the start of the webinar. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Professor Eric Schluessel here, Assistant Professor of History and International Affairs and scholar of Muslims in China. So let's dive into the discussion. I'm so happy to have you here. You ended with fragile transcendence. And when I read the book, which by the way is an incredibly poetic book, which it's beautifully written, sometimes heartbreaking, and you bring a lot of yourself to the book. And I felt as I was reading it that I was going on your journey in some ways, discovering this fragile transcendence within this practice. And maybe there's something there which can only be experienced through the reading. But I'd like you to elaborate on that concept a bit. Fragile transcendence for you is not just sensing that there's a saint somewhere to be but as you put it, it's almost, it is keeping God at arm's length, as you put it at one point. It's a space of ambiguity. It's almost a guide for future political and scholarly practice. I wonder if you could just expand on this notion a little bit and maybe tell us about when and how you personally first encountered a kind of fragile transcendence.
Thank you. Maybe I can bring in a story from the field, because this entire, in a way, attitude of fragile transcendence, also behind it, there's also a kind of attitude towards closure. Because, for instance, this one story I heard in the field, which really struck me at the time, and which in a way really helped me understand this notion of fragile transcendence. I think in the field, at one point, a very famous imam in his late 80s passed away, and he followed the last two Jahriyya saints before both passed away. So he was really a repository of sacred knowledge among the Jahriyya. And I was able to meet him a few months before he passed away, but I didn't record the interview at all. That was my mistake, apparently. And so I was talking to another imam about this death, and I was mourning his death and mourning the passing of this knowledge, because he didn't have many students, so there's no way for us to learn those perished practices that he still in his possession. And then this imam said to me, each generation carries its own knowledge, and each generation has its own murshid, its own saint. So it's bound to happen that some knowledge, some ritual practices will perish and will disappear, will vanish. No traces left behind. That's it. So each age will have its own closure, and it's futile to mourn the passing of the knowledge belonging to a past age. And each generation produces something more, creates something more, and you should never really mourn the passing of past knowledge. And that's an attitude of closure. It's very different from our notion of preservation, isn't it? We think there's a tradition, we need to preserve it, and tradition needs to be continuous. There has to be a continuity in the tradition. But he is telling me tradition from day one is not continuous and can't be continuous, and it's not bound to be continuous. There has to be this discontinuity, and between each generation, there has to be a break. So the death of this old imam represents the end of one age, and that's it. There's no use mourning it. And this fragile transcendence is an attitude built exactly on that attitude of closure, because you are accepting there's at one point, at some place, there was this so-called saint somewhere, and I don't know, and that saint left behind something, and that age has passed, and that's a legacy whose source I don't know. So in other words, a Jahriyya world in this case is a world filled with these unknown sources, and the attitude of fragile transcendence is about accepting these unknown sources and accepting the unknown and appreciating it and taking a step back and saying, maybe I am derived from another source of unknown as well. So who knows? So I really, in a way, really appreciate this kind of attitude in an age when we all strive for some kind of certainty, grabbing onto certainty, but somehow being comfortable with closure, with uncertainty, with unknown is something which I find really interesting and enlightening as well.
Oh, so that's interesting because, okay, look, at one point there's a story in the book. You talk about how in 1960, this great Sufi leader and master died, and he became sort of the last of the saints in a certain way. But it sounds like, in some ways, you're reacting to what happened after 1960. Is it fair to say? So can you tell us what happened to the community after 1960? Like, where's that tension that you're addressing in recitation and in practice?
By the tension between.
Well, what I'm seeing in some ways is that this is a book about the importance of things being unfixed and undecided.
Mm.
And if I'm understanding the book right, people have sensed that since the death of this master in 1960, there's just been a kind of decline.
Yeah.
And so there's this anxious grasping for fixity, right? Mm.
That's a very good point, because, you know, fragile transcendence in the book is really predicated on not the absence of a saintly genealogy, but its unfixity. But after 1960s, there's no more genealogy after 1960s, because there's no more saint after it. There's the guardian of the Sufi order, but not the leader, not the saint of the Sufi order. So in a way, it's precisely because of the absence of some kind of tangible saint at all that sense of comfort with unfixity has been eroded as well. So in many ways, you know, again, this is more like describing an ideal world which no longer exists in many ways. And I think some of the imams, some of the Sufi masters I spoke to among the Jahriyya, they were trying. I think because I did my work in my first field work was around 2010. And I returned around 2014 to continue the work, and left the field near the end of 2015. And then I returned in 2018, and that was a big change. So in some way, according to many of the Jahriyya Sufi masters, around 2010 to 2014, 2015, that was the tail end of that world, which I described in the book. After 2014 and 15, things really changed even more radically. although from the outside, we don't think it's changed that much. Well, if you know Islam in China, we know it's been radically changed, right? For Sinophone Muslims and for, not to mention, for Uyghur Muslims as well. So in many ways, I would suppose that grasp for fixity, for certainty, is even more severe now compared to before, which is in part confirmed by the recitation, because I was sent a piece of the oral recitation about a year ago, and there was no harmony whatsoever in the recitation. It's exactly, all of the voices were converging into one voice. So you no longer hear the history behind the recitation, and that's basically done by the Jahriyya themselves. And I suppose the imams I spoke to in the field would say, well, that's exactly a sign of our current change. And we are, in a way, destroying our own history without knowing it by preserving it, because that harmony was an organic outcome of that history.
That's really interesting. That comes across beautifully clearly in the book as well, with this incredibly rich ethnography. So we'll get audience questions in a second. So I'll wrap a few questions into one here, because I think that observation of yours leads you to certain methodological interventions in how you studied this community. You pay close attention to gender and women's recitation as much as you can, for example, which is a very important part of the second half of the book. So I guess I'll ask a broader question, which is, given how much things are changing right now, the restrictions on practice of Islam in China, access to communities, and given the history of the field of the study of Islam and Muslims in China, I'd wonder, what do you think is the path forward for studying Islam in China, or Sinophone Islam, or perhaps what should be the path forward? What have we been missing in the field that we need to focus on now? And how will it be possible to do it? Small question, obviously.
That's a massive question. And I mean, if I give a completely honest answer, the answer is I don't know. And I think this sense of not knowing, this sense of not knowing is prevalent in the field, given what's happening on the ground. Because I mean, I can't imagine myself doing the same kind of intensive field work now compared to 4 or 5 years ago. It's really radically changed. I mean, the school where I did my field work has been closed down, and it's been closed down for about 3 or 4 years. It took place before the pandemic, and the pandemic really made it worse. So I don't really know when the school will resume, if ever. But on the other hand, I think if we do want to carry on with the study of Islam, one possible route probably, I mean, we have quite a few people here who are working in this direction. David is here, well, 2 Davids, David Stroop and David Brophy, and other colleagues who are really trying to push for a more transnationally and transregionally oriented study of Islam in China, because we have different moments in the field, and in earlier moments we tend to pay more attention to the Han Kitab, where the Han book tradition, and now we begin to realize, for instance, one of the major books, Liu Zhi's Tian Fang Xing Li, it's one of the classics of Han Kitab, but that Han Kitab was actually learned in Arabic translation among Sinophone Sufis. So in many ways, the reception of Han Kitab among Sinophone Muslims is not always through Chinese. It's through Arabic and Persian, and it's through Arabic and Persian produced in this kind of multilingual process. So by paying attention to this kind of multilingual making of both Han Kitab and non-Han Kitab, we can really connect the world of Islam in China to the larger Islamic studies. So in other words, what is lost in terms of doing fieldwork in China can be made up by drawing these wider connections.
I think it's really nicely put. As I was reading, I was thinking, wow, this is intensely Islamic studies in a way that is also intensely Chinese studies. It's a really fascinating book, and it's again, the sheer depth of its historical and ethnographic research is going to be such a tremendous resource going forward. So I think what you've just said, though, about this inherent multilingualism of Islam in sort of Sinophone Islam in China gets us to a couple of our audience questions, which are, they're pulling back a bit, asking bigger informational questions. So Chris Gomez, a GW student, asks, for example, is the musical vocal dynamic that you are referencing more reflective of the Islamic or Chinese culture of Sufis in China? Now, I think your book is kind of exploding that question in interesting ways. So how shall we answer that?
I think, initially my suspicion is because the music is pentatonic, it's very much East Asian music. And so my initial intuition was, well, this is a result of assimilating Chinese cultural and musical influence, which is, again, is not incorrect. But at the same time, when you hear the recitation of Ibn Fari's poetry, the Wine Ode in North Africa, they break down the poetic meter, the poetic rhythm, in a similar, not in exactly the same way, but they also destroyed the original poetic meter in their own unique way. So, one can say, what's the point of saying this is specific to China? Because you see the same kind of, in a way, destruction of poetic meter in recitation among Muslims all over the world, even among those who speak Arabic. But, again, one of the Arabic dialects as opposed to so-called standard Arabic. So in many ways, and I even played a recitation to other people who work on Tibetan Buddhism and who heard traces of Tibetan Buddhist music in the recitation. And not to mention, right, as I mentioned, there are tombs all over China, Jahriyya tombs all over China, and the first generation of Jahriyya followers, there were Turkic Muslims, there were Tibetan Muslims as well. So again, the honest answer is I don't know, but I would say it's not entirely Chinese. The cultural and the musical influence is not entirely Chinese.
I think a lot of these questions are still, we don't really know, and things are in the midst of time. But the first chapter does this sort of archaeology of sound, where you're pulling out, like, you're through the anthropology of the present and the texts of the past and the present, figuring out how people learned to recite Arabic and how this peculiar way of doing it came about. And that's if you follow the threads, you can see just how complicated that question really is.
And sometimes people learn Arabic pronunciation, Arabic morphology using a Persian book without fully realizing it's a Persian book.
Which is it's like learning Russian through a Turkish textbook in some ways. It's amazing. So Isa has a couple of questions. Isa asks, for example, here's a good informational question for a lot of our audience. How is the Jahriyya recitation different from other non-Sufi Sinophone Muslims, such as recitations by the Qadim?
That's very interesting. And also because we don't have one Qadim either. It simply means the old branch. So Qadim in Eastern China, for instance, in Beijing and Tianjin or Henan will be very different from the Qadim in Ningxia and Gansu or even Yunnan. So in many ways, I think, because interestingly, we find extracts of the Jahriyya texts like Muhammad's, like Madayah, among the non-Sufi Muslims as well. So apparently there has been a circulation of texts between Sufi and non-Sufi Muslims in China. And likewise, there has been circulations of recitation among Sufi and non-Sufi Muslims as well. For instance, there are some non-Sufi Qadim Muslims in Yunnan who recite Muhammad's, and there is a distant echo of their recitation in terms of the tune with Jahriyya recitation in Ningxia. So I would say, they are not the same, but there are circulations of recitations and exchanges of musical styles.
Yeah, Diamond, just to reinforce what you said earlier, I think it's attending those circulations is one of our next steps forward in the field. Absolutely. I think that's what Isa was probably getting at in some ways. You might also ask if you could elaborate a little bit more about the curriculum of the Jahriyya Sufi learnings. So just give maybe a brief sketch or maybe a reference for our audience member to follow.
Gosh, that's a that's a very detailed question. And because we have different textbooks. I'm in possession of a few textbooks that Jahriyya used, but in many ways, the kind of basic grammar books and Arabic morphology textbooks are not different between the Jahriyya and the non-Sufi Muslims in China. And in fact, many of the books, if you, I think I examined 4 or 5 of these books in first chapter of the book. And many of these books were actually used by Muslims in North Africa, in Central Asia, in South Asia. They were common textbooks used by all Muslims in learning Arabic morphology, which is why it's so interesting, because you are basically teaching young children in China whose only language is Chinese, Arabic morphology and grammar, using textbooks in Arabic and Persian commonly used among Muslims who speak Arabic. So just imagine that. It's a multilingual process in the early days of a child's life without that child realizing there's a difference between these different languages.
I mean, okay, amazing stuff. So that last question came to us all the way from Budapest, and now we have one from David Stroop, our friend at the University of Manchester in the UK, who asks, in light of your explorations of the diverse linguistic origins of Jahriyya ritual, how do you interpret the political or social agendas of those who criticize the Jahriyya for being Sinicized, for example, the Ikhwani or Salafi communities in China?
That's a very good question. And for many of the Jahriyyas that I worked with, the attitude is ignoring the criticisms. Although that's not entirely true. If you look at Jahriyya's books, both in Arabic and in Chinese, they do have their own bones to pick with Ikhwani and with other more reformist branches of Islam in modern China. But I think as of now, the attitude is really to ignore, because now the major issue is to survive and to preserve the traditions. And as to my own attitude, it's really hard to have an attitude on this question, because I can see the reason behind each branch, and I tend to identify with a particular branch in particular circumstances. So I can't say I follow anyone. When I recite, I enjoy the Sufis, I enjoy the Jahriyya, I enjoy the loud recitation, I enjoy the melody, I enjoy the group dynamic. But on other questions, I enjoy the Ikhwani, their study of the modern texts and their open-mindedness to new ideas and new conceptions of Islam. So in many ways, as a researcher, I don't take a stand on these questions. Maybe that doesn't answer David's question.
Yeah, I think I read it incorrectly. So let's say an Ikhwani will apparently criticize a member of the Jahriyya for being Sinicized, right? But what you're saying is that actually Jahriyya practice is inherently translingual. So in that light, what is the Ikhwani or other Salafi or critical agenda? Like how would you evaluate the criticism that the Jahriyya are actually too Sinicized when you're demonstrating that really the recitation encodes a deep history that is transcultural and even trans-Eurasian?
Right. I think I misunderstood the question, actually. I think I can only presume, because I have never done extensive fieldwork among the Ikhwani myself, or the Salafis myself. So I can only really presume and speculate. I think one reason probably is either a refusal to engage more deeply, because again, Ikhwani is a new development of the 20th century, and so many things and political and societal changes were taking place in the early 20th century, and there were so many concerns. And in many ways, by borrowing this claim from new reformist branches of Islam in either Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, the Ikhwani local to China have in part ignored the possible rich traditions of the local Sufis, because they didn't really quite have the time to engage more intensively with these old texts. More attention were given to new texts brought back from abroad, and connecting these texts to contemporary trends in Islamic ideas and thoughts. So yeah, sorry, that's a very bad answer So I should just say, I don't know.
I mean, would you then say that the Ihawani are rejecting the possibility of fragile transcendence? Or would you like to just take the fifth on that?
Of themselves sometimes.
So, say again?
They sometimes appear too certain of their own ideas. That's, yeah, maybe no. Yeah. Again, as you can see, I'm perpetuating this kind of prejudice against the Ihwani.
No, it's not necessarily prejudice, but I think you end the book rather explicitly on a kind of note, not about, I don't want to say political note, but you try to make an intervention at the beginning and the end of the book about the notion of tolerance and the notion of acceptance and pluralism and all these things, and suggest that the Jahriyya experience prior to 1960 perhaps, or the one which is fading away, provides a path forward for the world. So I think you have taken a stance in the book, which is really interesting to think with. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. So like I said, this is a beautifully written book. And I'd just like you to tell me a little bit more about your process of writing and producing it. Because I think from the very first page, I was hooked by your prose and your way of communicating things, and of communicating sometimes very difficult, complex things that happen across languages in places and times that are very distant to us. So I wonder what challenges you experienced when trying to communicate this to your audience.
That's a great question. I mean, when I wrote the book, in my mind was our dear colleague, Rahima, because, in many ways, one book targets so many different audiences. And, as a book in anthropology, apparently, I expect, I hope, I wish other anthropologists would read the book. And secondly, it targets people in Islamic studies. That's why the book has to be, as you said, intensely Islamic studies. And because if you try to make that intervention and connect this field to the broader Islamic studies field, you have to really make colleagues in Islamic studies listen to you, which is normally not the case for the study of Islam in China. And we have this idea of the field being entirely, severed between China studies on one side and Islamic studies on the other. So the second audience was, colleagues in Islamic studies. And then, a book has to have, in a way, a higher goal than simply advancement of career or making some academic argument, right? And I was thinking about Rahima because, Rahima has done such a massive amount of work documenting the Uyghur Muslim practices, the Sufi practices, and that's really a very precious archive for all of us. And now we can look back and say, although the tombs have been destroyed, but we have these precious archive. We know how Uyghur Muslims existed before all of these went away. So my hope was also to create a book that can have this kind of historical value. At some point in the future, the Jahriyya, some future generations can come back and say, well, this is, at one point in history, this is how we behaved. This is how we performed the rituals. And there's somebody who at some point in the past wrote a book about us. And now, we can, put that book on our bookshelf and consult from time to time. So to produce a book that can be used in that way, one has to avoid too much jargon. And I think so. And also, I think language is essential because the message of the Sufis, the Jahriyya message and also other Sufi messages are meant to be universalistic, more universal, accepted by all. They're trying to imagine a different world and live in a different world in a different way. So a language that portray the Sufis, the Jahriyya Sufis, either as ethnic minorities or as a small parochial group resisting the state, does not do justice to their own intention of being a universal ummah, universal community, right? Because, for instance, time in their vocabulary is Guangyin. So they say in so and so's Guangyin,
Explain Guangyin. You do in the book. Explain it here.
Oh yeah, Guangyin literally means light and shade. It's a very poetic term, literary term for describing time. And for the Jahriyya, time is always pinned down to one person. One qutb, one qutb, one pole of the universe. Exactly. When you imagine the in Arabic poetic imagery, the pole that support the entire tent, that's the qutb. So each age, each Guangyin is supported by one pole. So they imagine the entire world, the weight of the entire world rests on the shoulders of this one pole, this one qutb. So in their mind, it's a universal community. Time, as a concept, and the whole world following that time rests on the shoulders of this one qutb. So how can you demonstrate that sense of universalism through language, through writing? So in a way, I have to be very careful in that regard, and not to. That's why you don't see a lot of, the state in the book. Although, in some chapters you do see the emergence, state violence and so on and so forth. But I try to stay away from that and really treat the Jahriyya as a community in and of itself. And the state intervention is some external factor. So that's, that relates to the language of the ethnography.
I wouldn't say it's jargon free, this book, but it's theoretically very sophisticated, I'll say. But it's theoretically sophisticated, it's methodologically interesting. The choice of sound as a medium of a path of investigation is fascinating and makes me feel as though I've missed an incredibly central dimension of life and history, which I ought to have been attending to this entire time. And so one thing I was thinking as I was reading this book was, how would I introduce these concepts to students? Because, recently I taught an Uyghur history class. And one of the difficulties, but also one of the valuable things about teaching this kind of history is that it gets us beyond the frame of the nation state. It gets us beyond the frame of the modern world and makes us think about time and experience and ritual in very new ways. So I'm kind of wondering, so you're in a department of religious studies up at Haverford, but for all of us who want to enrich our teaching about Muslims in China, particularly Sinophone, Chinese-speaking Muslims in China, I wonder if, as some closing remarks, I wonder if you might have some advice as to how we can integrate these observations better into our teaching and perhaps even our scholarship.
Oh, that's really a hard question.
Sorry.
I mean, all of us, for instance, have to teach about what's happening in the Uyghur homeland.
Yeah.
And for people like you and David Strug and David Brophy, you teach in larger universities, and you have students who either come from China, right, or come from elsewhere, but politically speaking, might hold different points of view regarding what's happening in the Uyghur homeland. And I have found in my own teaching that probably a better way of introducing Islam in China, and also all of these other complicated political situations, is in a way to not to start with the politics, but rather to show how these are wonderful human beings, how these rituals, these performances are absolutely beautiful and capturing. So by demonstrating really the charm of this world, and then afterward bring out the kind of occurrences and events that are bringing about the disappearance of these beautiful worlds, students can, it's easier for students to understand why we have to teach about these histories and politics, because these people first have to appear as proper human beings before they become victim. So it's in a way giving back their own dignity, which they never lost. It's just by focusing on these, to me at least in this ethnography, external factors, which are essential as always, but by paying more attention to these external factors, we're actually depriving the people of their own dignity. We're using the state, especially the nation state, which is a very boring, dreary institution, to let this one institution still the thunder of these wonderful people. So, let's reverse that order.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. A good class about modern China shows just how flimsy the notion of modernity really is. and should emphasize center these sorts of stories and experiences, and try to develop our appreciation of how ghostly and how haunted this age remains, despite our efforts to make it otherwise. All right, well, on that wonderful note, I'm going to say The Sound of Salvation, Voice, Gender, and the Sufi Mediascape in China is available for pre-order from Columbia University Press. The link is there in the chat, and we have an offer code CUP20 for 20% off. Professor Guangtian Ha from Haverford College, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm so glad to get this opportunity to talk to you about this book and have a little preview of it myself. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for attending. And please stay in touch with the Sigur Center. You can check out our YouTube, our Eventbrite, our newsletter, and there are links to all of those in the chat. We look forward to future new books and Asian studies events.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you so much to Sigur Center. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
You take care.
You take care.